So we're going to move forward and call this hearing to order of the Assembly Transportation Committee oversight hearing of the 2018 draft high-speed rail business plan. If Assemblymember Gray or Assemblymember Salas are present in the audience, would like to welcome to the podium, to the dais. Seeing that they're not here, we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, gentlemen. Today's hearing is an oversight hearing to review the California High-Speed Rail Authority's 2018 draft business plan. The authority is required to submit the plan every 2 years. Among other things, the plan is to include an updated schedule and cost estimate, update financial scenarios, and discussion of all reasonably foreseeable risks. The authority has a difficult task in delivering the high-speed rail system. They must build and operate a high-speed rail system under very specific design restrictions set forth in the bond measure, and that's including operating without public subsidies. Build the initial segment within very tight parameters required for the use of federal dollars. Complete environmental reviews and acquire property within a very litigious atmosphere. And clear some very real, very intimidating engineering challenges. In 2008, the voters approved Proposition 1A to provide $9 billion in bonds to help build the system. Now, at that time, the estimate for the full cost of the high-speed rail project was $45 billion. Since that time, the costs have fluctuated between a high of nearly $100 billion, depending on who you talk to, and down to $64 billion, and now the most recent estimate of $77 billion in this draft plan. Governor Brown has thrown his full support behind the project and remains committed to moving it forward. Members, as the funding partner in this effort, we, the legislature, share responsibility for this monumental effort. And members, let's be very frank. The project is at a crossroads. Today, we will hear from the authority and our other panelists that they do not have the funds to complete the initial operating segment, otherwise known as the IOS. This is to get high-speed trains up and running. This should be our main focus. And again, we are the funding partners in this project. As such, we must provide appropriate oversight and be part of the decision-making about its future. Today's hearing is about two things: taking a look at the status of the project and to fully discuss what will be expected from us, the legislature, if the project is to proceed. Members, the last time this committee heard from the authority is when we reviewed the draft 2016 business plan. The 2016 plan signaled a major shift in the development of the high-speed rail system. The plan switched the IOS, the initial operating system, from south to north to connect San Jose to Shafter in northern Kern County. The plan also laid out a more realistic funding scheme, although there were many risks involved. And a lot has happened since then. Construction in the Central Valley continues to move forward. Major structures have been completed by more than 1,600 craftsmen in that process. I have been to the valley to see the project, and it is very impressive. It also has made an undeniable impact on the people and the economy right now in the Central Valley. The authority successfully met the deadlines for Federal Recovery Act funds and began spending the Proposition 1A bond funds on construction. Two bookend projects, Caltrain in the north and the Rosecrans McQuart rail grade, I always call it Rosecrans, grade separation in the south, are moving forward. The authority itself has been through some changes, with former CalSTA Secretary Brian Kelly replacing former Director CEO Jeff Morales, and bringing in new management staff with experience both in overseeing large construction projects and complex organizations. And mostly important, the authority undertook a comprehensive cost review for ongoing construction in the Central Valley. This review produced what they call a true cost to complete number for the existing construction packages, with a couple of caveats. And the authority announced a $2.8 billion increase over the previous estimate of $7.8 billion. While this is troubling to hear, it is what it is and necessary to be accurate and transparent about the project going forward. These new cost estimates are included in the 2018 draft business plan. The 2018 draft business plan continues the commitment to a northern IOS, or Silicon Valley to Central Valley line, which is extended so that it starts in San Francisco and ends in Bakersfield. The cost of the IOS is estimated to be $29.5 billion, and this includes the current $10.6 billion for the ongoing Central Valley construction. The IOS would be funded by a combination of Proposition 1A bonds, federal funds, cap and trade pay-as-you-go, and cap and trade financing. This is the same funding scheme that was laid out in the 2016 business plan, which hinges on the successful long-term financing of future cap and trade funds. The authority outlines three critical elements to make this financing work. Three things the legislature must do. Extend cap and trade through 2050. Provide a minimum guarantee of funds every year to the authority from cap and trade or other state funds. Ensure future cap and trade funds for the authority will not be restricted, redistributed, or impaired. Not any of these are easy. In fact, all would be extremely difficult and may require a vote of the people. This is exactly why we need to fully understand the options and the implications of inaction. Members, we have to go into this with our eyes wide open and continue to evaluate. While previous business plans have provided some update to the vision of how high-speed rail could be accomplished, we are approaching a point where we decide to make the sacrifices and commitments necessary to see this through, or we come up with alternatives. This business plan lays out the needs and risks of moving forward, and we need to really consider both in this hearing, and I appreciate Mr. Kelly's pulling the Band-Aid off on this business plan. This is real. There's no smoke and mirrors involved in this one. We will hear today from Brian Kelly, the High Speed Rail Authority's Chief Executive Officer. We've asked CEO Kelly to provide us a brief overview of the business plan, and I understand he has staff with him today that can help answer any technical questions we might have. We've also asked him to then walk us through clearly and direct the financial plan for the system. We'll then hear from the Legislative Analyst's Office, and we have their cap and trade expert here for any questions of the committee. We'll also hear from the High Speed Rail Peer Review Group, whose work we should all be grateful for. These private citizens are putting their years of expertise into helping us govern this monumental project, and we owe them a great debt of gratitude. Finally, we'll hear from representatives of our regional partners without whom high-speed rail simply could not work. We've asked our panelists, Hassan Ikarata with SCAG and Jim Harnett from Caltrans to update us on the progress of their ongoing bookend projects, Caltrain in the north, and both the Rosecrans-Marquette grade separation and the Los Angeles Union Station project in the south. Members, proceeding with this project will not be for the faint of heart. So let's go into fully informed with a clear understanding of what it will take and get ready to buckle up. Mr. Fung, if you have any comments, I'd like to include you right now.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be very brief since we want to get into the questions of the presentations. But I want to thank the panel members for being here today to discuss the real challenges facing the High-Speed Rail Authority. As elected officials, it is our duty to ensure that state agencies operate in a transparent manner and that taxpayers' money is being used efficiently. Californians work hard for their money, and we must work just as hard to protect it. I hope that today's hearing can provide the answers to these pressing questions, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Vice Chair. So we have the panelists at the ready. We'll hear from each of them, and then I'm going to ask them all to stay at the table after we have our presentations. I'd like to have you all available for roundtable discussions following your brief presentations. Members, let's try to hold off on our questions until we get through all of the presentations. And for the public, there will be ample time to hear from you following the panel discussion. Because I suspect many of you will want to speak, I'd ask you to make your comments complete but succinct, and if it mirrors another person's comment, please just say ditto with that person's name. And to the extent you can help us focus on the specific items discussing today, that would be very much appreciated. With that, let's get it on. Mr. Chair. Mr. CEO now, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Brian Kelly, CEO for the California High-Speed Rail Authority. Pleased to be here today, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about the draft 2018 business plan. On March 9th, the authority released this plan for public review and comment. The draft 2018 plan presents a vision for implementing the nation's first high-speed rail system in the face of challenges that projects around the world of similar magnitude and complexity have faced and successfully addressed. For the first time in this draft plan, the authority is assigning costs to the risks previously identified in prior plans and reports, and presents a baseline cost estimate for all project sections. Also, for the first time, the 2018 draft plan discontinues the past practice of estimating project costs with a specific dollar estimate. Instead, the plan estimates costs utilizing a baseline estimate and ranges, consistent with best industry practices for mega projects. The revised baseline cost estimates show an increase in costs largely driven by the effects of inflation, increased contingency, and previously identified construction delays in the Central Valley. These areas make up about 83% of the cost increases associated with the full Phase 1 system build-out. The schedule for the valley-to-valley service from San Francisco to Bakersfield and the full Phase 1 service from San Francisco to Los Angeles and Anaheim are pushed out by 4 years respectively. Schedules will be affected primarily by the timing and availability of funding for project implementation. The draft plan also outlines a financing strategy consistent with the one outlined in the 2016 business plan to better align the timing and availability of cap and trade funds so the project can be delivered in a manner that provides benefits to Californians at the earliest possible time. In the face of these challenges, the draft plan proposes to continue a strategic investment strategy that builds infrastructure that will be linked over time to provide mobility, economic, and environmental benefits to Californians, and initiate high-speed rail service as soon as possible. Toward that end, the draft business plan identifies the following investment priorities in our constrained funding scenario. First, we'd meet our commitments to our federal funding partner. The authority will complete the 119-mile segment in the Central Valley and complete the environmental reviews for the entire Phase 1 system between San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Anaheim by 2022, as required in our federal grant agreement. Second, we'd extend the valley-to-valley service from San Francisco to Bakersfield. The draft business plan recognizes the high ridership and revenue potential of linking the Silicon Valley with the Central Valley between San Francisco all the way into Bakersfield. The proposal would deliver 224 miles of high-speed rail-ready infrastructure for use by 2027. The plan proposes to construct high-speed rail-ready infrastructure in the Central Valley between Bakersfield and Madera, and in the Silicon Valley between Gilroy and San Francisco, to reduce travel times for existing passenger rail systems, expand clean electrified service, and prepare the corridors for testing and potential early high-speed rail operations. Fourth, we'd isolate the tunneling in the Pacheco Pass as the final missing link to complete the valley-to-valley service. We'd engage public and private sector expertise to examine and refine design options, optimize operational efficiency, limit costs, and develop innovative funding options for that segment of the project. And 5, we continue the bookend investment in Southern and Northern California. The draft business plan continues to prioritize improving Los Angeles Union Station, the Burbank to Anaheim corridor, and the electrification of Caltrain corridor in the Bay Area. The plan in sum reflects the authority's commitment to apply lessons learned and to make organizational improvements necessary to deliver this project to initiate high-speed rail service between Silicon Valley and the Central Valley as soon as possible, while completing environmental work and making important investments in Southern California, consistent with action taken by the legislature to invest what are called bookend funds from Proposition 1A. With the release of the 2018 draft business plan, we have initiated a 60-day period of public review and comment that closes on May 7th, 2018. The final plan is scheduled to be adopted by the Authority Board at its hearing during the 3rd week of May. To my right are 2 representatives of our executive team. One is new to the Authority, and that's Joe Hedges, who is our Chief Operating Officer, who we brought down from Seattle, Washington. And to his right, my far right, is Russ Fong, our Chief Financial Officer for the High-Speed Rail Authority. With that summary, Mr. Chairman and members, I'm happy to answer your questions today. Thank you.
So if you have any other members that are at the dais now that would like to continue, we'll go ahead and ask questions at the very end.
You guys want to say anything?
Any comments? It's your plan.
No, sir.
Mostly here to answer questions.
Well.
Mostly here to answer questions,
Okay.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir. Any questions of the committee? Mr. Fong.
Thank you all for being here. How much money currently exists that you have right now?
Well, if you include the cap and trade commitment from the extension of cap and trade last year, we describe it in the business plan in ranges, Assemblymember Fong, because the cap and trade revenue is a bit volatile.
Let's stipulate that. How much money, if you include that?
We estimate between 20 on the low end and about 28 billion on the high end.
So you have 20 to 28 billion currently.
That's correct.
In hand, and you project in the business plan that the potential estimate is 77 to 98 billion.
The baseline cost estimate for the entire Phase 1 system is 77 billion. That's right.
So there's a delta of 50 to 78 billion dollars, plus or minus.
Yeah, as a ratio of sort of identified funding for the project and funding we have in hand, yeah, I'd say we have about a third, as opposed to in 2008 when the bond measure was first passed. The bond provided us about a fifth of the funding we need for the project.
Okay. And then I want to focus on page 15 of the business plan, the draft business plan. You indicate that the Pacheco Pass tunnels is the critical link between the Silicon Valley and the Central Valley, but right now you cannot afford to construct them because of a, quote, funding shortfall. Why does the business plan propose to build 2 orphan section tracks if there's no way to connect them?
Mr. Fong, there's a couple reasons for that. One, the authority has had for some time a principle of making strategic concurrent investments throughout the corridor that can be linked together over time. And also, that is a strategy to bring mobility benefits for Californians with taxpayer money as soon as possible. So what we propose in this plan is to make those same kind of investments on the Silicon Valley side by extending the electrification project all the way to Gilroy. So we have an electrified train service from Gilroy to San Francisco that both Caltrain can use in the short term and reduce their diesel train operations between Gilroy and San Jose. Would also be a corridor that we may be able to use with express trains sooner than 2029, perhaps as soon as 2026 or 2027. Similarly, in the Central Valley, under our federal grant agreement, after we make investments in the Central Valley, we are required under that agreement to find operational or interim use for the structures that we build. And so on that side, we are proposing to either to put those structures to use through either early electrification, combining that with the Amtrak service that's now available all the way to Bakersfield from Sacramento or the Bay Area, reducing that travel time, providing a user benefit in the interim while we move forward on the valley-to-valley section. In essence, the gap or funding shortfall we have is about the price of the tunnel. And so what we propose to do here is make interim use and investments on each side of that, isolate the tunnel as the issue, engage with industry experts and others on what the tunnel could and should look like, and pursue options for funding of the tunnel, and then get the tunnel built.
So what is the price of the tunnel?
It's estimated, it's in early design right now. It's still in the environmental review process. So it's a kind of a wide range, but it's estimated between, on the low end, 5, on the high end, about $12 billion.
12 billion. And currently you haven't identified any federal, state, or private funding for that gap?
Not for the gap.
Okay. And then in terms of...
Other than, it may be useful to say again, because we have, as the chairman noted in his opening remarks, there's a lot of uncertainty and risk in both our costs and our funding. And on the funding side, depending on what cap and trade comes in, there's a scenario outlined in the plan where if cap and trade comes in at the high end, our costs are at the low end, we have no gap. That's probably unlikely. So we estimate it to be in the neighborhood of $5 to $10 billion.
Well, I think the uncertainty is the problem, right? I
Yes.
mean, you've hit the nail on the head. The uncertainty around this whole project is, I think, what gives us as members pause in terms of this whole entire project. So I heard on an article that was mentioned that potentially you would ask, or High Speed Rail Authority would ask for a vote for additional funds. So how much, if that were to happen hypothetically, how much money would you ask for? If the delta is 50 to 78 billion dollars.
Yeah, I'm not sure what.
I think Mr. Richards mentioned in an article
in response
that
to
he'd
a question
be open to a future vote for additional funds.
We haven't had a dialogue about that in terms of whether or not that's the right pursuit. The pursuit that we lay out in the plan is utilizing the funds that we have to make interim investments now that provide benefits now on each side of the tunnel, and ultimately complete the environmental work, complete the design work, and pursue funding for the tunnel element later, as well as for elements in Southern California after we complete that environmental work. So beyond that, I don't have a plan to go to the voters for any specific amount of money for this program.
And now, in terms of the federal funds, my understanding is that if there's a time frame that it has to be completed for those federal funds to be utilized, or they have to be refunded back to the federal government. Is that correct?
We've received $3.4 billion in federal funds. We have already spent $2.5 billion of those. The remaining $928 million is in a fiscal year 10 appropriation that we have not accessed yet, and we'll use at a later time. If we fail to complete the Central Valley part, or otherwise shut down the project, we would be subject to repayment of the federal funds we've already spent.
So how much funds? So you have the 25 to 28 billion you currently have. So what is it going to be used for right now? Or the 20 to 28 billion dollars?
Yeah, we would utilize those, as I suggested earlier, for a couple of things. One, we proposed in this plan to spend about $500 million on Southern California, what they call bookend investments. The chairman noted a grade separation in that area called Rosecrans-Marquardt that is, at one time, was the most dangerous railroad traffic crossing in the state. So we are funding partners for $76 million on that. The remaining $423 million we would use for redevelopment and an expansion of the LA Union Station. In the Central Valley, we would use it to complete our work for the 119-mile stretch that we are now in construction on. We would expand that into Bakersfield, making that stretch approximately 140 miles, and get that to be high-speed rail, electrified, ready infrastructure. And we would invest to expand the electrification of Caltrain on the peninsula side all the way to Gilroy, which ultimately we need to be electrified to get into the Bay Area. And we would pursue further, all the environmental work on all segments of the projects would be completed, and we would pursue further improvements leading to the tunnel section on both the east and west side of the valley-to-valley service, or the Pacheco Pass.
Okay. Now, in terms of you've given a pretty wide range in terms of your high end and your low end estimates. So you have 77 billion to 98 billion. How reliable are those numbers? Since we've seen over time those numbers have continually changed and increased.
You know, prior to my arrival at the authority, the board had initiated a cost to complete exercise in early 2017. The numbers that are before you, which we call the baseline estimate, is the result of that exercise. That's where you get the 10.6 billion in the Central Valley. That's where you get the 29.5 for the Valley service and the 77 billion for the statewide service. So that's the baseline, which is done on an estimate of alignments we would use, materials you need, a series of other.
And that is, I'm sorry to interrupt. That assumes the fully funding of the gap that of a particular
that's the
path.
entire system at 77, be the whole Anaheim to San Francisco service phase 1. So that's the baseline. What we are doing differently in this plan that the authority has not done in the past is, you know, I'm uncomfortable coming here for a project of this magnitude when we don't have all the environmental work done, we don't have further design work done, to just leave it at a simple dollar estimate. So what I've included here is utilizing what I would call best industry practice to provide a range around that baseline. If we manage well going forward, we can come in below that 77. We have a low range of 63, which is close to the estimate from the 2016 business plan, and a high of 98, which is generally the swing under industry practice at this level of project development is 20% below, 30% above. Where we know more, like in the Central Valley, that swing is lower. It goes 5% below and 15% above. So we use the baseline to lay out our best estimate, and then we applied industry best practices on what those swings could be.
Okay. And if I'm correct, the authority has more than $1 billion in unspent cap and trade revenues. Why hasn't the authority spent, or what is it planning to do with that $1 billion if they haven't spent it already?
We have spent some cap and trade dollars, not a huge amount, but some in the Caltrain corridor for the electrification project. Russ, I'll look at you.
Russ Vollen, Chief Financial Officer. We have about a little over $1 billion in cash for Prop 1A, and also a little over $1 billion for cap and trade. Those are targeted for the Central Valley segment that we're currently underway now. So those will be for the Central Valley segment, and also to make sure we meet our agreement, which is requires a 50-50 match.
Last few questions, and I'll let my colleagues continue on. I think in the business plan, as I read it, you've proposed, I guess for the first time, or maybe this is the first time I've heard it publicly, indicated that you would potentially borrow against the cap and trade revenues. Wouldn't then that be using a lot of the cap and trade dollars for debt service?
Yeah, let me start this, and then Russ, I'll have you jump in. That's not a new idea in this business plan. In the 2016 business plan, the scenario that was presented in that plan assumed a financing of cap and trade as well. What we did in this plan was articulate it with a little more specificity what the industry has recommended, the kind of things you need to make the cap and trade dollars financeable. It needs to be a stable source of funding, to be investment grade, so we're looking for a floor of a commitment, an extension of cap and trade dollars to 2050, and a non-impairment language is ideal. Also to get an investment grade rating. So those are sort of three things the industry has recommended that you need to get the highest investment grade rating for the financing. But the idea of financing cap and trade really has to do with being able to bring dollars forward to meet our capital construction costs at the time the capital construction needs to be built. Doing a mega project of this magnitude on a pay-as-you-go basis would have us constructing this thing all the way out till 2050 or beyond. And so the financing element is simply to bring dollars forward so you can get the work done sooner.
I guess my concern is that I don't know if in the debate of cap and trade that there was any justification to use cap and trade to pay bond debt. And so in terms of investing cap and trade dollars, I think a lot of folks were anticipating that you would fund projects, actual deliverable projects, instead of using it to fund bonds. And so that's clearly a concern there. And then in terms of the assumptions you make, you're assuming, though, that the legislature extends cap and trade post to 2050, which is an open question currently, right? Yeah,
it's an open question, although, again, I would just say from a planning perspective, we utilize the assumptions from the 2016 plan that had cap and trade going out that far. We would note that it was extended last year. We don't need the extension or the financing immediately. It's not something we need directly in 2018. We're hoping to be able to finance in the timeline of roughly 21 to 23, roughly in that timeline. And so that's why we've laid it out as, again, this was first raised in the 2016 business plan. Here we're saying these are the kinds of things you need to get investment grade rating. The only thing I'd say further about financing the cap and trade money is the cap and trade program did dedicate money to this mega project. It is not unusual for many of the sales tax counties from around the state that dedicate sales tax money to transportation projects to bond against those revenues. It's very common for projects of this size and scope, so that you can pull the cash forward to, again, be able to meet the capital needs of the project in a timely way.
But I'm assuming then that you would be using some of the cap and trade dollars to pay down debt and interest on debt, correct?
That's right.
So I think the public and you would need to know that that money is being diverted from one project, but for one project to pay for debt service.
Well, it would be paid to debt service to pay for the construction of the project.
Then I guess my last question is, in terms of reading the business plan, the draft business plan, I mean, there are still a significant amount of unfunded assets in this project, correct?
I'm not sure what you mean by unfunded assets. I'm sorry.
Well, there are, on page 41, you term Pacheco Pass as an unfunded asset, and there are a lot of assumptions being put into you're assuming a lot of revenue that potentially may not materialize. So there is a lot of still gaps in this business plan.
There is no look, this project from day one has never had all the funding it needs to be completed. As I said at the outset, in 2008, when the voters approved the bond, they provided 1/5 of the money for the entire completion of the project. Now we have about 1/3 of what we need for the entire completion of the project. Therefore, our strategy has been to invest the dollars that we do have to provide benefits to the public as soon as we can in an incremental way. And that's what we continue to pursue in this plan until we identify additional funding for elements of the project. I would note that that's not an uncommon practice to build transit systems around the state. You build what you have with the money you have, and ultimately you expand over time when more money is made available for expansion.
Well, I appreciate the candor. I just think that Californians are now seeing this bill coming forward, and I don't think they really truly understand the true gap that exists between the funds that we currently have as a state and the lack of funds that are necessary to build this project moving forward. Thank you.
Any other members of the committee have questions of the panelists? Mr. Gibson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I certainly appreciate, I'm the new kid on the block. This is my second meeting of the Transportation Committee, and thank you very much, Mr. Chair, for convening this. Certainly this has been an enlightening experience for me to be brought up to date, and certainly welcome your office reaching out to me personally and letting me know the history that's behind this. I think that, again, the voters of California has voted to move this project forward. Certainly it's the governor's wishes to move this project forward. And I know this project has had some shortfalls based on as you described, in terms of the financial shortfall that exists. And certainly you don't know how the environmental impact is going to affect that particular budget. And I appreciate you stating that up front. Certainly I think that it's going to be beneficial if in fact this project can get off the ground. And I think that it was demonstrated by your leadership being brought here to the committee and also your new role and responsibility. Let me ask you just this question. Can we get it done?
Yeah, I believe so. I mean, I had a pretty good job, but I took this one because
right.
I believe in this project. I think it's the most transformative project I've seen in 25 years of working in transportation policy in California. I think it provides mobility, economic, and environmental benefits like no project I've seen before. So, look, we've got work to do. We're going to need to partner with you. We're going to need a continuing partnership with the federal government to get it done. I think what we're trying to propose in this plan and recognizing the challenges, and the chairman did a fine job of articulating all the risks that this project has been operating under. I think, our job is to push forward, as we said, make the investments we can make to provide the immediate benefits that we can provide as we go, and isolate the issues that need funding going forward. And that's what we've laid out in this plan. The project has, as I said, very important economic benefits and mobility benefits through the state of California. And I think it's very important to bring this thing to fruition.
Thank you.
Mr. Harper?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I want to follow up on an issue that I had brought up last year, and it kind of will more elaborate, I think, one of the points that Member Fong was trying to bring out, the Vice Chair. And that's about, I'm pessimistic about the project being completed. And the worst situation that I see is that if something gets partially completed and what does partially get completed isn't of use. So that's why I always want to make sure to keep always asking about the question of compatibility with existing Amtrak stock with North American standard gauge, that 4 foot 8.5 inch standard gauge, so that if you build a nice path right down the Central Valley, then that can be used. Because the current problem with Amtrak is that it uses right of way that's leased from private companies, and it doesn't have the precedence over their freight stock, and that ends up being one of the biggest problems with our existing Amtrak system is having to yield. And so, the question I'm trying to get the heart at is: are we building on that standard gauge so that there's that back compatibility that it can be used by Amtrak or standard freight or passenger if we fish or cut bait situation?
We are utilizing standard gauge for the construction of the project. I think the issue may be for some, particularly freight, and I'll be candid here, the benefit of the project in many ways and what sets us apart from our other passenger rail systems in California is that for large stretches of it, it doesn't share railroad with freight. It doesn't, share right-of-way or with freight, which makes it capable of traveling at high speeds and does not have to wait for freight traffic to move. So that's an important distinction for this project. But as a general matter, standard gauge is what we're moving forward with.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Assemblymember Baker?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Kelly. I'm pleased with the expertise that you bring to the High-Speed Rail Authority in the background. I mean, it is good to see, given the challenges facing the project. I ask a slightly different question than can it be done, and really be focusing on should it be done. Right. Because every penny that we're talking about that is going into the project or hasn't gone into it yet, but you'll say we need, can be spent elsewhere. It comes from somewhere. It could be invested on the bookend projects. It can be put in so many other projects that not only create jobs and great economic opportunity in different parts of the state, but actually improve mobility. And I know we're going to hear from the peer review group, which has done great work. One of the 4 options they lay out early on in their report is to end it, end the project. Take a look at it and say, you know what, it's kind of like the cartoon where there's a train going and they're building the tracks as they go, and it just keeps going in one direction or the other, and pretty soon, you wonder where it's gone. That, to me, is a little bit how the project feels. Not any reflection on the expertise of those who's been working on it, but just how it's evolved in the last 10 years. So that scenario that they have, even the second scenario, which is to complete some of it, the Central Valley project, I have constituents in the Bay Area who say, I know exactly where those dollars can be spent better. And so let's end it and move it somewhere else. Can you talk to us about the why shouldn't we end it instead of continue on and possibly, like that cartoon, putting the rail in front of us as we move along?
Well, I'd say a couple things. One, the 2018 business plan does not reflect a departure in the strategy going forward from 2016 in terms of what we would build first and the direction we would go. It's consistent and continuous. So I agree. I wouldn't want to hop around, and I don't think we do. This gets back to what I said a minute ago about the project. Why should we continue? For me, the greatest value of this project, and a value that I have not found in any other transportation project in my time here, is the mobility benefit from high-speed rail. the idea that we can build something and reduce travel times versus a car, for example, going from San Francisco to LA from 7 or 8 hours to 3 or less is outstanding. And the ability to move people from the Bay Area to the Central Valley instead of a sometimes 3 or 4 hour trip on the highways to do it in just over an hour is a difference maker. I think it will change the way people move. I think that's been the experience around the world where high-speed rail has been put into place. And so in terms of the should, for me, it's that kind of mobility difference that I can't name any other project being able to achieve. The simple reality, which my colleagues are tired of hearing me say, is that no matter how many lanes you build, cars on the highway can't go 200 miles per hour, but high-speed trains can. And that is the difference in cutting travel time. And so, to me, it's a very important project to really give Californians an option to move around that they don't have today and severely cut travel times in what is otherwise a very congested situation around our state. So that's the why for me. And again, I want to be clear that the strategy we lay out in the plan is to make investments that are not lost investments, and it will not be stranded investments. Extending the electrification of Caltrain in the Bay Area to Gilroy will have some interim benefits for Caltrain and some long-term benefits for us. And I feel the same about the structures we're building in the Central Valley. Our requirement is to put those into use, and we would continue to do so. Final point is that the cap and trade dollars also have to result in some greenhouse gas emission benefits. Not every transportation project can achieve that at the level that this one can. So there's also an appropriateness to those funds being used for this project in our estimation.
Thank you. It's important to me, and I think the committee, to hear your how you lay that out. Like, why, when we're confronted with the question of should we stop, one of the central parts of your answer was that it's going to be there's going to be improved mobility, that compared to a car, high-speed rail will go faster. And there have been criticisms, and I don't know that we'll hear them all out here, about just how much high-speed rail will be high-speed, whether it's sharing rights of way, whether it's sharing different track. And that the comparison, first of all, that it will be 2 to 3 hours. At least in the public, that is really greatly, the credibility of that has been lost. And that the comparison is with a vehicle when we have technology that's moving forwards in so many ways. If you can comment on that, as well as, Bay Area mobility or Los Angeles or San Diego mobility, the amount of mobility improvements we can make with these dollars might not be from LA to San Francisco, but might be all around the greater Bay Area, all around the Central Valley, and all around Los Angeles and San Diego or in other parts of the state. They just wouldn't be spent on high-speed rail. So to me, I also look for the greater mobility for Californians. It's just I don't see it as the only way to have it is through this project. I think that's more of a statement than a question. On the first one, though, can you address the comparison that you're making, that you're going to have a 2 to 3 hour ride from LA to San Francisco when so many other promises about the project have failed to be kept?
Well, I would say that, our operating guideline and the folks who do the operation design work for this project are guided by the requirements of Prop 1A. And that is a design requirement to be able to operate the system at 2 hours and 40 minutes between San Francisco and Los Angeles. As a design matter, we will design to that. We'll have a system that will have different station stops. So it will be designed to meet the criteria of Prop 1A as an operational matter. It may take a little longer with station stops to be, say, 3 hours to go from San Francisco to Los Angeles. But again, versus your travel options today, if they are either in a train or a car, it's not even close.
How much confidence do you have that it's going to be 2 hours and 40 minutes to 3 hours? When this is built, that it's going to be, you personally, your confidence in that?
Well, again, the design criteria is the 2 hours and 40 minutes. The travel time with station stops will be higher than that.
Okay.
But I'm confident, certainly, that we'll be in a 240 to 320 horizon, depending on how many stops you make and which train you're on, express versus non-express.
And one of the reasons why there's been so much skepticism about the speed, because we're comparing different is the shared lines.
Yes.
And you have examples of how fast you can go on a shared line.
Yes. In the areas where we're in urban areas and we have shared corridors, like in the Burbank to Anaheim area and in the Northern California area and the Caltrain stretch. For stretches of that, in those relatively small stretches of movement, we'll travel between 110 and 125 miles per hour, depending on where you are. But the bulk of the travel through the Central Valley will be in excess of 200 miles per hour.
Well, a slightly Bay Area centric. So
Yes.
I'm thinking of the
Yes.
San Jose area, either San Jose to
Yes.
Gilroy or all along
Yep.
that line. How fast is that going to go?
I think 110 is our estimate today.
And when you mentioned that it's where, kind of what I'm hearing is because Prop 1A said it has to be about 3 hours, that you have to design that way, it's going to be. That's what I'm hearing, is because that's what people were promised in 2008, that's what we will have.
Yeah, the design criteria that's in the bond bill is for 2 hours and 40-minute design criteria. We're designing it to meet that requirement.
There were so many things promised at that particular point as well. It'd be difficult to see how we're going to be there, particularly with the shared track and the challenges we have. But I am grateful that you're the person who's trying to take a look at it and find us a way to get there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Daly.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As you mentioned, the stranded cost issue has to be dealt with, and I like where you're focused in that area. And one example is the Burbank to Anaheim segment, which even if the line never gets over the Tehachapi's, which is my real question, is that challenge of tunneling or going over the Tehachapi Mountains from Palmdale to Burbank. I like the improvements from Burbank to Anaheim, but it's really not a statewide system and doesn't meet the intent of the voters if it never gets from Bakersfield to LA or Lancaster or Palmdale. It's Palmdale, excuse me. Palmdale to Burbank. Has there been any progress with the technology or the cost-benefit analysis for that link? Because all the reading I've done, it seems to be getting more and more complicated, more and more challenging, maybe cost prohibitive as a elected official and as someone who looks at how much things cost to get from Palmdale to Burbank. Not to mention the NIMBY aspects and other opposition, but just the dollars. Mm-hmm. So any progress on that?
Yeah, well, we continue to move forward on assessing different alignments. There will certainly be tunneling through the Tehachapi's. I think we have on the order of more than one tunnel. I think we have a 15-mile and an 8-mile tunnel in that stretch. So, and look, while it's a little uncommon, perhaps in America and certainly in California, for that level of tunneling, it is achieved around the world. A 33-mile tunnel just recently opened in Switzerland. They build tunneling through mountainous areas for high-speed rail all over the globe where they have it. And we will be utilizing that kind of expertise when we look at our options here. So we have 3 different alternatives from the Palmdale to Burbank scenario. All of them have tunneling elements in them, and they are included in the cost estimates that are presented in the business plan. But it's true that, and this is why it's important that we move forward on the environmental and we further refine the design of these segments, because the cost level it has a high swing. It could be as low as 12 or as high as 25 to get through that section. And so you do things like further the design refinement of that. You bring in expertise to provide options to move through there, and you can construct it in a way using the best available technology to provide a low-cost, maximum efficiency effort. And that's our duty going forward as we work on this project. But those are the 3 alternatives down there. All involve significant tunneling.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions of the committee of this panel? My turn. Oh, Mr. Kensinchu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. How are you doing, Mr.
Chu.
Kelly?
Good to see you.
I'm sorry I missed part of the presentation, was downstairs taking some vote in the revenue and tax. Real quick question, and it's really a question close to the district I represent, is when can we actually see the, if everything goes well, when can we see the first train arriving in Dearden Station? Is there any estimate?
A couple answers to that. The first is, working closely with our Caltrain partner on the electrification of that corridor. We propose in this plan to electrify further south all the way to Gilroy. Currently, the electrification project is San Jose to San Francisco. We'd like to complete that work under this plan and do some work with our early train operator to see if we can't get electrified trains in service by 2027. In that area.
Gilroy?
Yes, all the way to Gilroy.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's pretty much anticipating that the high-speed rail will be coming to town?
Sharing, Gilroy, San Jose to San Francisco, we'd be sharing that corridor at that time with Caltrain.
That's the blended system
Yes.
that we're talking about.
That's correct.
Okay, great. And second question was regarding to the minimum guarantee. I know that 25% of a cap and trade money will go to this high-speed rail. When you're talking about minimum guarantees, are you talking about $500 million, which is the low estimate, or $750 million, which is the high estimate?
Yeah, today we have a percentage share continuously appropriated out of cap and trade at 25%.
Right.
And if we were to replace that with a dollar value, I think our estimate here, we do a lot of things in ranges here. We had a low range using the 500 and a medium range using the 750 per year. I think based on the last three auctions, we've brought in, since AB 398 passed, we've brought in about $540 million in the last three auctions, with one more to go since that bill passed. So we have an estimate of 750 as a reasonable baseline going forward.
So 750 is the baseline.
Yeah.
In other words, if we cannot get $750 million from the cap and trade, then we have to move some of the general fund to continue supporting this program.
Well, I'm balking only because, again, under current law, we have a 25% commitment, and how much that turns into on a percentage basis depends on how much the cap and trade brings in totality. So if there's an estimate that it could be much higher in the out years, and so we'd be higher. I guess what we're saying here, if we're going to replace it with a dollar sign level, 750 would bring us about the 27 to 28 billion that we referenced in this plan.
Okay. Yeah. I guess I just felt that more comfortable with the percentage level, because the cap and trade money fluctuate up and down. Now you're giving us an absolute dollar amount, $750 million, and that may require that we use some of the general fund to backfill the difference.
That would be, I suppose, true only if that was, a firm floor. Although it's not necessarily that it would come from the general fund. I mean, I think, again, what we've said here is if there was a dollar sign baseline, 750 would get us this much versus our percentage amount today.
Okay, that's what I'd like to point out, my concern. Thank you.
Any other questions, committee of the panel? So, Mr. Kelly, you talked about earlier as lessons learned, and I know you have your COO here, and some of the expensive lessons learned was the right-of-way acquisition. How are we going to purposefully be able to move forward? I mean, when I'm a contractor, I always never built a house that on property I never owned. And so when you look about this, it kind of has the concept of building the plane on the runway, okay? So what are we going to do moving forward? Because I also, as you know, we both served on the Public Works Board together, and we saw a lot of eminent domain coming towards us from that process, and a lot of people that were mad about how they were treated, what they were told. And so what are we going to do moving forward to acquire this in an appropriate fashion that also is of value not only to the project but the taxpayers who are paying for it? Okay, can you answer that?
Mr. Chairman, you're putting your finger on one of the great lessons learned from this project. It's worth noting that about 63% of the cost increases that were identified in this plan are tied to having gone into construction or issued construction contracts without all of the right-of-way in hand. And what I mean by that is then required us to buy additional right-of-way to stay ahead of the contractor and had us pay some delay claims because of that. Also, if you don't have all the right-of-way, you don't know all your third-party agreements, and you don't know all of your utility relocations. So the construction contracts were let before all that risk was identified and fully mitigated. That is the prime lesson learned here that we would be implementing going forward, is that we would not make that mistake again. We'll have that risk much more identified, managed, and mitigated before we go into construction contracts. On right-of-way itself, we have realigned the right-of-way and third-party agreement duty in our organization to a new manager, a lawyer that we have reassigned strictly to that purpose. I had a vacancy in our director of real property that we are now filling, and we're putting it all under an expedited legal process within our organization. We're also working closely with the contractors to identify the critical path parcels that need to be prioritized as we go forward. And we are throwing additional resources, hiring more resources to focus on the right-of-way issue. So we're doing a lot of things to move forward on that. I would also say that our right-of-way process is a little unusual for a linear transportation project. The process that we use is more familiar for facilities that are being built, usually involving the Department of General Services. In the transportation sector, typically you don't go through the Public Works Board, and you don't necessarily use DGS. So we would be seeking to work with you all on a right-of-way authority that mirrors more what Caltrans does in their process, where they can self-do several things until they what's the term I'm looking for? They can, on their own, do things like appraisals, negotiations, and other things without going through the DGS process. That is more common for transportation, DWR, linear transportation projects. We'll be working with legislators on that authority here so we can expedite our process as well. So those are a few things.
You mentioned securing $750 million of yearly cap and trade. If that wasn't brought forward in that period of time, would the general fund have to make up the gap?
I mean, it's not, it's a couple of things. It's not necessarily the general fund, first of all. I mean, what we're saying in this business plan is today we have 25% of an annual total that's cap and trade. Depending on what that's going to be going forward, according to LAO, the low range is 500, the high range is 1.7 billion. We, for planning purposes, put 750 in this plan as a planning matter, trying to estimate what would be a reasonable number. We talked to the Department of Finance about it and others, and that's the number that we plugged in here. So if we were to replace the percentage with a dollar sign and we wanted to make it financeable, we would want to try to make that a floor of some kind. But whether that was, whether the floor was some commitment was made from other cap and trade monies or something else remains to be seen. It's not necessarily a general fund commitment.
So, and again, if we're identifying a number, I just want to know who's going to be the backstop. One of the other things is my understanding about cap and trade is at some point in time, it has a diminishing amount of money that it comes in because you're using it for mitigation, and as results acquire that you don't need as much money coming in. So it's supposed to have a downslope of income. And now we're saying, I mean, my understanding is that the draft plan either assumes it's a static or increasing amount of revenue, I don't think that was the intended purpose of it going out is AB 32. So I think what we're looking at is redefining cap and trade with an extension. Is that what I'm hearing for the 2050 plan?
Yeah, the extension, Mr. Chairman, is just a consistency with the assumptions in the 2016 plan that cap and trade for purposes of funding here would be available till 2050. We did talk to CARB and note that the greenhouse gas emission reduction requirements go all the way to 2050. They expect that cap and trade would be an element of our climate change proposals going forward. While it's true that over time you would hope there's a diminishing amount, you would also see the expense of each allowance probably go up. And so we made an assumption of what we thought was a reasonable estimate of 750 based on estimates we've seen of what the cap and trade program could look like going forward.
So we've made a commitment to thousands of people on this project, who've companies, employers, labor, that and when I walked that project, and actually the artistry of the work is unbelievable. It's fantastic. And we, like I say, we've made a commitment to these people that have actually relocated to be able to work in these areas, from the trades and vendors and whatnot. So we look at the business plan, and I don't see anything about the debt service that would have to be paid on any money borrowed. So we look at, if it's $77 billion and we don't get federal funding and we don't get private partnership, and so now we have a $77 billion debt, over a 30-year period of time, it would cost us X. See, I always like to see the total burden of the project. And so, I think that's an obligation that we have as legislators to completely understand the whole package. You're telling us what it's going to cost, real-time dollars, but not 30 years, the debt that we're incurring for future legislatures and people that are, going forward. So that I would like to see included, and then also you and I had a discussion about what the environmental, people need to know what the environmental costs on this project were. It's astronomical. And the clear benefit that this project does bring for reductions eventually, that there's been no credit given in the environmental aspect going forward. It's just, those are some of the things that you and I had that early discussion about, the exorbitant costs of the environmental when we actually are trying to achieve something that is environmentally sound.
Yeah.
It's kind of a oxymoron, really. But that, those are some of the things. But in the draft business plan, I think we need to see real-time numbers.
Okay. Just one comment on that, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah.
There is a chart in the costs section. In that chart, it notes how much cap and trade we would have for capital costs. The actual amount we would bring in is in excess of that. But as you note, some of it would be paid for financing because, again, we want to bring the dollars forward to meet our capital expenses. So we would actually generate more than the amount or the capital cost. But, again, we propose to finance so we can get the work done sooner.
Well, and we also know that as it gets more costly as time goes on, because we have wages that go up and cost of materials and that's just inflation.
Yeah.
We have to be conscious of the fact of, is it going to be affordable to utilize? There's no public subsidy to run this in the bond measure. And so, I think I saw something, it was $91. And there's nothing more than I want the Central Valley to have the field of dreams of this opportunity to be able to work in San Jose or LA. It's absolutely, I think it's phenomenal. Because I think the Central Valley has been overlooked for many, many years. Other than Prop 1B, I think we dropped $1 billion for 99. But we have to look and see, is there a tipping point that, is this actually a reasonable amount of money for somebody to go to work? If that was one of the intended purposes.
Yeah, I think under our ridership assumptions. About 59% of the trips would be leisure trips. About 41, I think, would be business. I think that's the breakdown. The 93 is an estimate of ticket prices that we use for the ridership figures. The idea is to be competitive with airline travel and airline ticket prices. And, you know, ultimately what the ticket prices are, we'll be using our early train operator that we just brought on this year to help us work that through. And there would probably be different prices for different users, depending on frequency of use, how far you're traveling, all of those things.
One last question. So we're absolutely clear. Please walk the committee through exactly what the legislative action will need to take place to implement the funding plan you propose for just the iOS. What are your expectations of the legislature?
Well, if we are to complete the financing element of the cap and trade, ultimately we would need to stabilize the cap and trade amounts going to the project, so it would be an investment grade revenue stream. And in that regard, we noted in the plan that ultimately an extension of the program would be helpful out to 2050, that there would be a dedicated amount of cap and trade for the project that is reliable over time, a floor, if you will, and some commitment that that would not be an impaired amount of money. So those are the three elements to make something investment grade if you're going to finance a revenue stream. So those are those elements that we would need. We're not looking at moving to financing until, again, roughly the timeline of 2021 through 2023, roughly. We'll also be working with the legislature this year, we hope, as I said earlier, on some of the right-of-way process improvements that we talked about earlier.
Okay. Well, any other questions? Mr. Mathis.
Sir.
So I want to make sure we're absolutely clear, because you're saying you're betting this on future cap and trade dollars. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's the only source of ongoing revenue we have for the project.
Here's my biggest question for you.
Yeah.
Within the cap and trade deal that we just negotiated, there was ACA 1, which then goes to Prop 70, which gives the legislative body the ability to vote on the funds. If at that point we vote to take the funding away from you, quite frankly, I don't understand how you can business model plan with a proposition on the ballot here in a couple of months, not knowing and not having a guarantee that that vote won't come or that proposition won't pass. So you're betting against chickens that aren't hatched yet on money that you do not have, and you're telling us this is your business model and this is your plan, but yet come June, if Prop 70 passes, then come 2024 when we have the vote, you may be not, and you're already cut off of federal funding, and then you may be cut off of state funding. So I don't quite understand where you intend to get the funding if that is to happen, or how you're able to project funding beyond that point at this time, because there's no certainty until after those points have happened.
If the legislature cuts off funding, yeah, we have a problem. What this plan does is try to lay out a plan, and what I will do in the 2019 project update report and the 2020 business plan is come back to you and continue to refine and lay out the program and the plan, so that if you have an opportunity to vote in 2024 on redirecting cap and trade dollars, we've laid out a proposal for you and a plan for you that you would not want to do that. But should the legislature decide to do that, we'll have a problem.
So you currently only have one plan. There's no plan B or other contingency plans?
No, well, look, we're required under the statute to estimate and lay out for you what we would do with the available funds dedicated to the project. And that's what we've done in this plan. We certainly welcome other funds.
But that's not what you've done in the plan, because as the chairman just said, you haven't calculated out the cost of inflation for when the project's actually going to be done. So
we have in our cost estimates.
So you've got all the cost estimates of what this is going to look like with the inflation, with new. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm honestly expecting to hear something about the tariffs going on with the still cost too while we're here, but you have no guarantee on your funding, sir.
Amen. I agree with that. We have no guarantee on our funding. And that's why we're saying we need the cap and trade dollars to be solidified. And that's why we laid out in here what that looks like. I got to say that I don't agree that we've been cut off permanently as from federal partners. I believe that we will be in a position we have such a dedication to state revenue for this project that I hope we'll continue to have a relationship with the federal government. And no matter what it looks like in some snapshot in time, we're going to continue to try to work that partnership going forward.
Mr. Kelly, please get the rest of us the crystal ball that you're seeing the future with so we can understand where you're coming from. Thank you.
Any other questions? Mr. Kelly, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members, appreciate it.
You guys, please make us proud. So we'll move forward with our next panel. The LAO and our peer review group, thank you for your patience.